Today, we are turning wood into marble using epoxy. Now, I am doing this on a piece of plywood because I want to use that as part of my project. But you can also do this on a countertop in your kitchen or a bathroom as well. Now, this is my first time using epoxy to make marble, so we'll see how that goes. But here's what we need to get started. So first, we need epoxy. I am using Maker Epoxy from Total Boat. This is a very easy to use epoxy. It's a 1-to-1 mix, so it's really easy to measure it out. Of course, you need some measuring and mixing containers in different sizes. We need pigment. Now, pigment is really your choice. I'm gonna have a white marble base, so this is white pigment. And I'm gonna do black streaks, so this is black pigment. But really, if you wanted to, you could add blue, green, silver, gold. It really is up to your imagination. And also, you need plastic drop cloths to protect your surface. If you are doing this in a bathroom or a kitchen, you want to protect all the other surfaces with plastic drop cloth. And if you are doing a board like me, you want a way to lift it off of the surface. So painter's triangles work well. I am going to be using these project blocks, and I will add a link to all of this material in the description below. But now, let's get started. I was actually reusing a board from another project which was already stained. So I used my sander to remove as much of the stain as possible. To my surprise, I was actually able to take off quite a bit. But of course, if you are starting off with a plain sheet of plywood, you can totally skip this step. So before we pour the epoxy, it is very important to seal the plywood. Since this piece of plywood had been stained in the past, I used shellac-based primer to make sure that none of that stain seeps through with time. After the first coat of the shellac-based primer, I just used regular primer and applied another coat. There is one step that I missed, and I would highly recommend you don't. You need to cover up the edges of the plywood to hide those layers. You can use edge banding, or you can use a couple coats of wood putty. I didn't do this, and in the finished product you can actually sort of see the shadow of those layers. So if you want really smooth edges with the epoxy, be sure to cover these up before applying the primer. Once the primer had dried, I gave it a quick wipe down with 220 grit sandpaper and wiped off all the dust. Now, before we pour epoxy, there is one more step. We need to protect the bottom of our board from the drips, because those drips can be a beast to clean up once they have cured. I am using this masking tape, which works beautifully with epoxy, and I highly recommend it. I will add a link to that in the description below. I made sure to apply it perfectly along the edges, and the best way to do that is to actually have a slight overlap and then come back with a sharp knife and cut off any excess overhang. Now let's pour the epoxy. I am using 1-to-1 epoxy, so it's really straightforward to mix. I added part A and part B and set my timer and went ahead and mixed it. Now, I am using Maker Epoxy by Total Boat, and the mixing time is about 4 minutes. But if you use a different brand of epoxy, be sure to follow those directions. You want to mix it really well by scraping the sides and the bottom as you mix, but you also don't want to mix very vigorously because you don't want to introduce too many bubbles into it. Also, remember, every time you work with epoxy, you want to wear a respirator, and you want to work in a well-ventilated area. Once the mixing was done, I separated out a little epoxy in another container and then mixed white pigment into the main container. I wish I could tell you how much I mixed, but as you can see, I literally eyeballed it. You just want to make sure that your epoxy is opaque. Once the pigment is mixed in well, it is time to pour. I started with a zigzag pour across the surface and then used a spreader to spread it out evenly. You can always add more epoxy and spread it out until you have a nice even layer. You can also use your hands to make sure that the epoxy coats well on all the surfaces where you need it to be. I gave it a couple of minutes to let all the bubbles float up to the surface and then used a heat gun to pop all of them. If you see any particles at this point, it is okay to pick them up with your fingertips because the epoxy will self-level and cure. Now it is time for the marbling. I mixed black pigment in the epoxy that I had separated at the beginning, and about 10 minutes after pouring the white epoxy, I made the streaks to create the marble. Now there really is no right or wrong way to do this. I just did them all in the same direction because that's the look I was going for. And then I just messed with them with my heat gun, with my fingers. I added more white epoxy, I added more black epoxy. And to be honest, this was the part where it was really hard for me to decide the right time to stop. It's a very forgiving process, but you also need to know exactly when to stop. And you can easily just keep going and have fun with it. So while I mess with the pattern, let's have a quick chat about the sponsor for today's video, Freedom Mortgage, who is actually our current mortgage company. You don't see what is in front of me or behind the camera, but we need a complete renovation of the garage, and at the same time, we have been considering adding an extra room above it. These types of projects can be a huge financial investment. If you have equity in your current home, then you can easily use that with a cash out refinance to fund home improvement projects. In fact, we refinanced with Freedom Mortgage a few years ago, and the process was extremely seamless. Not just home improvement, you can also use the cash from your home's equity to pay for education, major expenses like medical bills or credit card debt, or even take that much needed vacation. The money that you take out may not be taxed upfront, but always discuss that with your CPA. Interest rates are high, but they are still lower than the current inflation, which means that you are getting your equity out at a discount. Freedom Mortgage is a top mortgage lender, the nation's top VA lender, and has been in business for over 30 years, servicing over 1.5 million customers across the United States. If you are in the market to refinance or get a new home loan, now could be the perfect time to connect with Freedom Mortgage. You can learn more with the link in the description. Now let's get back to the epoxy. As you can see, I worked that epoxy up until I was happy with the way it looked, and I also made sure to overflow it over the edges. And then I just let it cure for over 48 hours. I actually covered it with cardboard boxes to keep it free from dust. Once the epoxy is cured, it's time for the final layer. This is just plain epoxy with no pigment. Now you might wonder, and I did too, why would you need another layer of epoxy? Because epoxy by itself is nice and strong, right? But trust me, as soon as you pour that second layer, it creates this depth in that epoxy, in that pattern, that makes it look so much more real. Once the final layer was spread out, I popped all the bubbles with the heat gun and then let that cure for another 48 hours. And that is our piece of marble plywood. Okay, now let's take the tape off. You should pretty much be able to pull the tape off with the drips. But if you have a few areas that are a little stubborn, you can use a heat gun to soften the drips and they pull right off. Of course, you want to be very careful with the heat gun and you want to make sure that it does not hit your hand directly. And that, my friends, is the marble plywood. I used it as the counter in my bar cabinet, but the possibilities are endless. Thank you so much for watching. Here are a few other videos that you might enjoy. And don't forget to hit subscribe because I have lots of fun tutorials and projects coming your way soon.